Okay, as a player, this is going to be the screen that you are going to see the most in relation to those that are available on the main startup screen here. Um, in the upper window, portion of the window rather, you will see a history of connections. And this symbol means that you're currently not connected. The server is up. It's not responding. I suspect it might go red if I shut down my system. This symbol here, this symbol here represents a password protection on it. So it is locked by a password. And that's what you'll see here. So this guy, it looks like there's one down here. He looks like he actually has an open connection where there are no passwords. And it looks like it might be a tutorial process of some kind. But there's an additional list down there that actually show this symbol as well in relation to the lock. So there's a consistent nature between these two. Localhost is the system that you had connected to, and this will be the name of the campaign that you had connected to. So if you're playing multiple Lost Mines of Phandelver campaigns, it can get a little confusing. So you'd have to remember the host that you connected to in order to make sure that you're connecting to the right campaign on your game night. Down here is a listing where my mouse is disappearing, is a listing of games that are running off of the cloud option. And so if you watched the DM's create a new campaign video, the previous video, then you will have seen how that ties into campaign creation. So one of the options that a DM can select is the ability to run off of the cloud, and whether it's a public or a private cloud entry. I do believe that private entries don't actually physically show up. It may also be that the private ones show the lock. There's some additional testing that I have to do in relation to that, and I may do that before I continue the rest of the video. I'm not entirely certain. We may get to that, so I may show you the different options there, but I have to be a little bit careful because there are other games that are currently listed within that lobby that I don't know if they're actually meant to be displayed publicly or not. So I've got that area blanked out. Um, in the bottom here, you'll see that there's a join by GM name, and once again, if you'd watched the previous videos, you would see that I had created a campaign that had that particular GM name entered into it. And if I hit start, it should connect to the system because that does get registered on the Fantasy Ground server. However, because I'm within a LAN network here, I'm actually just going to connect by localhost. And in relation to this connection, this and this are actually the same connection. I was executing a test, so I wanted to show you the history, and it looks like you can actually clear the history out here. The port here will default to 1802. The IP address that you can put in here, or DNS name, it doesn't have to be IP, could be a host name that your DM gives you. It could be localhost if you're on the same machine, which would be kind of strange if you're an actual separate player and a separate DM on the same computer. That could get a little awkward. Or an internal IP address for a LAN network. So 192.168.0.1, for example, if that happens to be the machine of your Dungeon Master is running off of. In most cases, the port will remain the same unless you're told otherwise. So if you're not told that there is a port difference, chances are that DM's just using the default, and most people tend to. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to pause the video, start the connection to show you what this looks like once we get into the campaign. Right, so immediately after clicking on the start button, I got an authorization failed. That's because there was no password prompt to be able to put in a password, at least nothing that I saw. So this is considered your first password prompt. Now, there actually isn't a connection that has been made according to the DM screen that I'm looking at. So I suspect it's the default behavior of Fantasy Grounds on your first connection to show you this, and then you have to type in the password to actually complete the connection. So I will do that here, and you just click this retry button, and it will begin the process of connecting. So I will click retry, and then once I feel it's close to actually loading up the Fantasy Ground screen, I'll bring back the recording. Okay, at this point, it's actually starting to acquire the file list. So when you initially connect, the system will begin to pull down a list of all of the modules that the DM is going to be sharing out to its players. And that process takes just a matter of minutes, if that. I mean, I think it took about 30 seconds in this case, but I'm also on the same computer, so it might be a little bit quicker that way. I don't know if it ships out the files at that particular point or if it does it during this particular phase where you actually see the Fantasy Grounds loading phase. But regardless, the DM is, or your system is now pulling down files, or will shortly be pulling down files from the DM server, and then that will give you the basis to what you're going to be able to do on that particular DM's system. And what I'm going to do now is just pause the video, let Fantasy Grounds finish loading, and then I will bring you back to showcase that particular part of the process. Okay, so it's literally 10-15 seconds later, and Fantasy Grounds has now loaded, and I will give you a quick run through as to what you're seeing here. And this is the default screen that you as a player will see. A DM screen gets a few additional items that are not actually displayed here, but they're specific to a DM's functionality. And okay, so what I'm going to do is just quickly run through everything. So the first thing that you'll notice is that there's a campaign setup screen. And in a lot of cases, unless you click the show on load option there, it will always display, or unclick it, it will always display. Generally, a DM is going to tell you what modules you have to manually load, and I'm going to create a separate video with that information in it because I still have to finalize the campaign creation in reference to what I've got going here as the demonstration. But at the same time, this video isn't really about getting your interface configured the way that the DM is going to want to, because there's going to be a lot of communication back and forth in relation to that particular portion of the screen. I just simply wanted to show you what the interface looked like, because at this point you haven't seen it yet, unless you were already familiar with Fantasy Grounds. And that is where we'll go in relation to the remaining duration of this particular video. So the campaign setup screen will always show up on load, so you don't necessarily have to worry too much about that. So we'll come back to that in a bit in another video. When you initially connect, though, you will get this character creation screen. And Fantasy Grounds, when you right-click on the background or right-click on a window, gives you a bit of context. In most cases, it's close window for something like one of these two windows. Here, this is non-lock so that you can move it. Down here, again, it would be an unlock so that you can move it. So Fantasy Grounds has that context capability, and you can see here that it tends to be a radial menu that'll pop up. And the more things that a particular window supports through the right click, the more options will show up along this radial menu. But you'll notice that there's no ability to create a character in this particular radial menu. I don't know why that ability is not there in this case, but it just simply isn't. To actually create a new character, you click on this little button down here, the little green button in the case of this particular demonstration, and it's called an add item. When you do that, it's going to create an empty character sheet. So don't worry about the fact that you can't see it here because there's no picture for it to display. So it's literally just a transparent portrait right now. But it also opens up this particular window. That character is owned by the account you connected as. It is not owned by the DM, although the character sheet itself lives on the DM system. So you can close this window. You can always get back to it through the context menus up here, and I'll get into those in a moment. Or you can click on the portrait here to open this particular screen. And again, I'll get to that in a moment. But if you unintentionally connect with a different username to a particular campaign that you had connected to in the past, it's entirely possible that your character won't be listed in the actual character screen, or this button here is the one you click on. So there's not going to be anything listed until you give the character a name, and then it will start to appear. But if for some reason you lose your username or you've changed your username, this will be blank. And the reason it will be blank is it's mapped to the user you connected as, or the username you connected as the first time you connected and created the character. A DM can release ownership on that particular character, and it will pop up in your window here. You just have to close this and then reopen it again. So it's not like you've lost the character. Just don't panic is essentially what I'm saying. There are ways to get it back to the system. So let's move on. I'm going to temporarily close that and just leave that up there. So this is the chat window, and I'm going to dedicate a video to just going over the features of what's in that chat window and how to move it around, size it, and all that jazz. But things like dice rolls, events that the DM has initiated, like votes, things like that, or another player has initiated in the case of votes. A DM will periodically throw in a description in that particular window as well that the party is to read, stuff like that. Essentially, this will become the ledger of the overall campaign. So if you wish to be able to go back after a campaign's complete and write up a short story of it, this will become the gospel element to that particular ledger. Now, a lot of DMs mix Fantasy Grounds with a voice chat software like Discord or TeamSpeak or any of the others. So you're going to lose the verbal aspect of that. So try to keep as much in the chat windows if you are looking to create a write-up of it later on or create a whole story around it later on. Otherwise, you'll lose the context of what did I do there, for example, during a dice roll. Additionally, dice rolls will appear here. So whenever you roll a dice, whenever you take damage, whenever you make a save, fail a save, so on and so forth, they all show up in that particular window. So it's a combination of chat and a stats window. I kind of wish that SmiteWorks would create a tabbed capability here so that you could separate chat from those stat rolls, or set it up so that when you get into the combat tracker, which we'll get into here shortly, that it switches over to that particular tab, and then you have to flip back and forth, or it splits the menu in some way, shape, or form. I just wish there was a way to split it out, but that's just a personal gripe of mine. This option down here is where you can actively modify the roll on a particular dice. So if you want to be able to give yourself advantage or disadvantage, now granted, you can't just willy-nilly do that. A DM's going to question why you're rolling with advantage if there's no reason for you to be rolling with advantage, or same with disadvantage, so on and so forth. And they'll see all of these modifiers here in the chat window when you make a roll. So it's not something you just simply get away with. But you can also do a custom modifier, and I'll get into that particular window when I do a run through with some combat. These are your dice. So this is a die 20. This is a 12-sided die. This is a D10 and can be used for percentile die. We'll get to that when we do the dice video. This is your 8-sided die, your 6-sided die, and your 4-sided die. And you can move them around, and under the old version of it, they would kind of pop back to that spot. So I'm kind of hoping Unity has fixed that as something that we'll test during this particular run through. Over on the right here are a number of buttons that you're going to want to get familiar with, and this one will become one you should get to know quite well. And this is where the library is for all of the modules that the DM has shared to you, and we'll open that up in a separate video. This is really just an interface familiarization video. Within that library are reference documents as well, so you can actually get almost a full copy, if not a full copy of like the Player's Handbook, for example, or any supplemental guides like the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, things like that. There's player-specific elements that will appear there once you've opened them up in the library. This Assets button is new to Fantasy Grounds Unity. It was not in the previous version of Fantasy Grounds, and I will cover that in a later episode because it is so new. It has a lot of features built into it, but things like portraits, your tokens, stuff like that will appear within that. And it really is there to showcase what's on available to you at a file system level. Items are for item cards that you know of, or are available or being shared out through one of the modules that you have. So for example, with the Player's Handbook, the minute you activate the Player's Handbook or open the Player's Handbook, and all of the items that are listed in that Player's Handbook will now become available within that particular button. and it will pop open a separate window that you can look at. So for example, right now I have no modules loaded, so it's showing me nothing. NPCs, again, custom NPCs or NPCs that like a druid can make use of, for example, will show up in here. Familiars, stuff like that. So any NPC that is publicly accessible will appear in that particular list of windows. And you can sort by them, so on and so forth. But this is mostly used by the DM, less used by the players. Same with the story. This is primarily going to be used by the DM. And story notes that are shared will appear here. But generally, I don't think any of those... I have yet to run into a situation where I've intentionally shared out a particular story note. So I honestly don't know if anything will actually appear there. Image and map. So any image or map that has been shared over to you, the client or the player, will appear here. And maps that your characters actively connected to or loaded on are accessible by double clicking on this particular port. No, sorry, correction, on this particular port. It might be both. We'll confirm that once we get there, but I think it's the token. You double click on the token and it will pop open the map if you haven't got it open yet. So if you ever lose the map for some reason, you can just pop open your character sheet, double click this, and it should bring the map open. And we'll get into that once we get into an actual run through when we do a sample campaign. Notes. This is one thing that players will use on quite a regular basis. At least some of my players do. You can actually create new notes in this window, and you can record information in there. And even though it will be stored on the DM's computer, it is accessible and owned by you. So you can always go back to it, open it up, and it adds some additional information, and it's saved each time you add the information to it. Other players can actually share notes. So you can share a note that you have as well. So there could be a party ledger, for example. There could be, well, although you don't need it for items, but you can make notes, information, common information that everybody has, that kind of thing. And you can do private notes. So it is possible to do that. And I'll show you an example of that during one of the campaigns. Character screens we've already seen as well. Other windows that you will become familiar with are going to be things like this combat tracker. And when a DM throws you into an encounter, or you get thrown into an encounter by something that a party member did, then your character, your party character, or the rest of your party will appear here, as well as any NPCs that you're going to be interacting with, whether it be on a positive note or on a combat note. They will all be added to this particular window. Traps will also be added to that, so just beware. Traps are treated as NPCs in Fantasy Grounds, so that you can actually look at potentially either defeating them if you're trying to attack them, for example, like a tripwire, for example. You can attack the tripwire and cut it or destroy it. That's going to be an actionable event that the DM will throw into a combat tracker, for example, or sometimes. This one here is what's called the party sheet. And there are a couple of tabs here, so you won't be able to necessarily see all the party members unless the DM is configured to do that. And I'll get to those settings when I do the DM configuration of the campaign. Now that we've got a campaign created, we actually still don't have the campaign physically started. This will be the party sheet for inventory. So we're on the inventory tab here. And what will happen is as the party acquires coins, items, stuff like that, it will appear within this list. Any item that is not identified will be in this list, but it will be indicated as an unidentified item. So it will be easy to pick out anything that still needs to be identified by either a mage or someone with a very high history skill or arcane skill, things like that. Coins, however, will appear here, and the DM has the ability to divvy those coins out through an interface quite easily. It'll automatically split the coins out and then leave any odd amounts inside of the parcel coins section, just so that at a later date, if something happens to even out, you can split it again and away it goes. An order. This is actually a marching formation order as well as a watch order. So a DM during rest nights will ask for a watch order, and the parties can add their portraits to here to show the order that they're in, and same with the marching formation. So the DM can drag that formation over onto a map, and it'll place the characters pretty much like that formation is set up. So you can get quite detailed onto that. Now, hopefully, With Unity, the characters don't get deleted from this particular screen because that's a royal pain in the ass having to rebuild the formation each time. Excusing my English. Calendar will only be available if the DM has enabled date time tracking for your campaign. So generally, for starter campaigns, you won't see this. If you're new to a game, you may not see this unless it's a really experienced DM. But typically right now, I don't generally run with a calendar activated for my campaigns. We just ballpark the timeframes that we're currently in. As in a lot of cases, it adds a lot more in the way of complexity to the whole process. Color palette, you can actually change the color of your dice. Now you'll notice here that these dice are now colored black, and all I did was open up the color palette. That's because that's the default color for the palette. Until you actually go through and adjust the colors, then the dice themselves will stay that black color. And you can alter the color of the text to be a little bit clearer. If you happen to create a darker colored dice, you can make the dice white in their font. Or if you make a really bright die, let's see, for example, in either case, well, let's do this. So adding white, and I suppose that's add black. Let's go dark. So yeah, you can see there where it becomes important. So you can adjust the colors, and it's cumulative. So if you want a large amount of blue thrown into the color, you click on this button. If you want a medium amount of blue thrown into the color, you click this button. And if you want a minor, like a tiny amount of blue added, then you click on that button. And it's the same for all of these. These ones, it's literally just additive on equal amounts, and the text just changes the color. Modifiers are typically thrown in when you are in a very specific situation. So let's say you're crouching behind a rock, or you're crouching behind a tree, things like that. You can throw these modifiers onto your character, and it will automatically take that into effect for 5th edition anyway. And as a result, your character will be harder to hit. And damage, I believe that pretty much is mostly automated at this point, so I don't think you'll ever really need to worry about this, except for the odd situation, maybe specific to a spell that hasn't been fully automated in some way, shape, or form. But I've yet to run into a situation where I've had to have a player go through and do that. Now, there are other things that can happen when the party is going through a particular campaign. You might fall down a particular embankment and slide on your butt all the way down and be prone by the time you get to the end. So you have to click on that and drag that over to your particular character. So that would be considered the effects. You might become unconscious. Again, that is something that theoretically can be automatically triggered depending on the combat situation, or the DM just might throw it on you because you've walked into something, didn't realize it, and you're knocked out. Things like that. So there's all of these effects that a DM can throw onto your player character, but you can also throw them on to yourself, provided the DM has allowed it in the configuration. And then finally, you can go into the individual setting screens. Now, the campaign setup is mostly done by the DM, but as a player, you'll want to click on this modules one. And the reason for that is that this is where all of the libraries get loaded. And the next thing you'll want to do is go into options, which is literally just this window. And there is a tokens, generally. Maybe they moved it because of the changes that they've done. There used to be a tokens window that popped up here under the previous edition. So this details what this particular is. But once you get to near the end of this, you get the options window, which is really just this window. Most cases, you won't be able to change these. In a lot of cases, this is going to be DM-centric, and the DM is going to set this up to function the way that they want the game to function. So, for example, the dice tower here, you see I can't change it on this particular screen, and you typically do so through simply clicking on that option. But these buttons here are accessible to you as the player. So, ring on whisper, so if somebody sends you a private chat, it can ding. You can do manual entry on the dice, depending on the DM. They might not allow that. I think the default is to enable it. You can remove on a miss. So if you've got a fireball that you're launching at a group of NPCs, for example, You can target all 12 of them if there's 12 of them within the sphere of effect. And if any of them manage to save on their particular dexterity saving throw, I think it is, then they will actually be automatically deselected from a target in some cases, but at the same time still suffer half damage when you do the damage roll. But another example would be the case where you make an attack roll, you completely miss, they will become unselected from your next attack roll, so you have to retarget them in some cases. Now, it doesn't happen when you're doing a melee weapon. Sometimes it happens on ranged weapons, but it's mostly with spells that it can happen. Specifically spells that can attack multiple creatures in one run, but a dexterity save completely negates the damage. That's where you'll see that the most. And then auto center map, so whenever the next creature in the combat tracker comes up with their turn, your map will adjust to that particular location. In a lot of cases too, it will automatically center on your character when it is your turn. So it allows you to move around, but the minute your turn comes up, it'll snap back. And we'll get into the map functionality in another video, because that itself requires a complete video on its own. And then there are languages. So if you're ever curious as to what languages are enabled in a particular game, they will show up here. And currencies, in this case it's the default 5th edition ones, and it will show up there. And then setup will complete the actual setup. Okay, so that is generally the interface. Now I will go back to this character sheet to give you a little bit of a rundown here. So the character sheet is very basic, and now this is a 5th edition specific character sheet. It's going to be different depending on the rule set that you're running through. So this will be different from a Pathfinder sheet, and additionally it'll be different from a Starfinder, I think it's Starfinder, sheet as well. So on the side you'll see a number of tabs. The main sheet is where you configure your portrait here, your name for your character. You might have one or more inspiration bubbles up here that you can choose from. You will have a token that can be assigned to your character to differentiate you, and some DMs will do a top-down token, some will do like a little pog. So it really comes down to what the two of you negotiate as what you want for the token. And then you can set this as the active PC. So if you are carrying or controlling multiple characters and you want to talk in chat, you can click this to tell which character you're going to be controlling in that particular chat. Your class, the proficiency level, the background to your class, and the race that you have chosen for your character are all in this section here. And we'll get into a lot more detail when we go through creating a sample character. Your abilities will be here, as well as any senses that you have. So for example, dark vision will appear here. Your perception rating, this is your passive perception. So certain events can be triggered off of passive perception or an active wisdom roll for perception. Your armor class, your initiative, and your speed will all be dictated based on your abilities here and armor that you have. Any characters that have special moves or special defenses, those notes will be added here. And then this is where your character's hit point summary will be. So this would be the max amount of hit points. So a ranger, for example, I believe is a D10. So the max level 1 ranger would be a 10 here. How much damage you have suffered. So for instance, if you have 10 hit points of health and you took 5 points of damage, then 5 would appear here. If you took 6 points of damage, then a 6 would appear here, or might even be a 4. It depends on how they changed it for the Unity version. And then temporary hit points. So if any spell that adds a temporary hit points to your character, they will be added here. So let's say +5, then you would have 10 + 5. So you'd have a total hit point value of 15. Any damage you suffer will be depleted from your temporary hit points first, and then will come off of your total hit points. Your hit die, so this is your actual hit die for gaining additional hit points down the road when you level up. as well as if you want to heal a bit during a short rest, you can expend hit die to be able to recoup some of your hit points. And then it even provides your death save functionality here. So S for successful death saves, F for failed death saves. And then finally you have your save stats here. Under skills, this will be things for along the lines of your acrobatics, perception checks, persuasion, stuff like that. So any skill that you become proficient in will appear in this particular list here. And it's relatively self-explanatory. And a lot of these bonuses and stats will change depending on what you have rolled here, what your race, your background, and classes are. Abilities, we will get into a lot more detail when it comes to creating the characters, which I'm going to create probably 2 or 3 for the sample campaign, or even just use the default, but I'll probably go through a curation of 1 or 2 just to show you what it looks like. And we'll get into that in a lot more detail. This would be the inventory that your character is going to be carrying. And it will, as long as the DM has encumbrance enabled, calculate that down here, as well as treasure. So this is where your coins and potentially your gems, stuff like that will be recorded. Notes, so this is where you, as a player, can customize your character, setting your gender, your age, height, weight, size, which would be medium, for example, for an elvish or human, but a small for a gnome, possibly tiny for a gnome. What alignment your character is going to be, what god they worship, and then personality traits that define your character that the DM then might play off as part of the a side quest in the campaign or something to that effect, or that you yourself will role play as part of that particular campaign. So if you don't give 2 hoots about a particular type of beast, then you won't be too overly upset if somebody happened to kill it, i.e. a horse, things like that. Although killing a horse is pretty stupid, but anyway. And then log. This is primarily used for league-based games. I personally don't use it for any of the campaigns that I do or adventures that I do, but it can be used for stuff like that. But typically you'll have a faction that you're associated with, a DCI number for your league campaign number, and then the adventures that you've completed with this particular character. I don't typically use that for any campaign that I work with, but other DMs may. And then weapons. So when you get actionable items that you can do things with, i.e. a longsword, you can attack and do damage with that. A longbow, you can attack and do damage with that. Your spells, you can cast a spell, whether it's invisibility, whether it's cure light wounds, things like that. All of those will be added to this particular list. Now, some things will also have to be manually added because they don't automatically populate. So as you're choosing spells, for example, you'll have to drag and drop them onto this particular screen in order for them to populate. And again, we'll get into a lot more detail in relation to that once we get through the character description. But in general, that is the Fantasy Grounds interface. There are more extensive elements we'll get into, for example, with the maps, being able to create some notes, going through items once we get the modules loaded, in addition to the module loading, things like that. So there's a lot more to this. This is just a high-level overview of what is here. And I will continue on with getting the campaign set up in another video. And within that video, a bit more in the way of explanation will be done there to show how a game will be set up and what features they toggle and whatnot. And then once I've completed that, we'll be able to start creating the characters, because everything will be loaded. It'll be ready for the characters to choose to actually have. So right now I don't have the ability to do classes or races or anything like that yet, because I haven't loaded that up in the campaign. All right, so I'm going to stop the video here, jump on to the next video for the DM stuff, and then we will circle back to actually getting a character created in the following videos.